Ah, so hear the story tonight. We're going west, far west, so far west that we'll come to a star. At least that's what my boss says. My boss, she doesn't travel except by caravan, even across the city. I'm always part of the caravan. Sometimes she rides with me, sometimes she rides elsewhere. She moves around the caravan to prevent assassins because she is one of the powerful in the city. Me, though, I mean, I'm just along for the ride, as it were. And this time, going out of the city, going traveling for real, I was excited and nervous about going beyond all that I had ever known, beyond all that I had ever dreamed. We set out on the road through the city, past the gates, past all that I had ever known. I had seen people travel my whole life, but I'd never thought it would be me heading west with all the other travelers from so many parts of the world. That's why I decided to keep this journal. I wonder how many of them see the star up there in the western sky. How many of them are curious about it, as I am. I'm finally picking this up again. I guess it won't be daily. Traveling is both fascinating and tedious. Through the mountains, up and down, up and down. There are times when you get glimpses of great beauty and these amazing panoramas. But mostly it's just rocks. Lots of rock. In many ways, it doesn't look all that different than home. I do see my boss from time to time. She's usually buried in work, making complex calculations, annotating these incredible charts, and often sending messages back with her findings. Most of us by this point are already a little travel worn. Our clothes are wrinkled and we're maybe a little bit on the grimy side, shall we say. The boss? You'd think she'd never left her carpeted office with its silk drapes and its teak furnishings, as pressed and as poised as ever. It felt like she was still more present in her circles of power than with us, though admittedly she never had been one for hanging out. The caravan was a means to an end for her, a way to follow the star, to carry the gold, to bridge the distance between groups of wealthy and powerful people. Today we came to a crossroad, with another route coming down from the north. It was a market town, so we stopped for a few things we needed, and though it wasn't really late yet, we decided to stay the night. It ended up being a good thing that we did, because over dinner, the boss was having one of her assistants take a memo, and a stranger heard and came over. He was as well dressed as my boss, just as pressed and polished, though the quality of the fabric wasn't nearly as nice. For though the clothes were well kept, they also seemed subdued, as though designed to help him blend in. And really, though he approached my boss in the clear desire to talk to her, his demeanor was hesitant and apologetic. Yet when she finished her dictation and noticed him, and he began to speak, it was clear that despite his lack of confidence, his words were of great interest, and indeed, when he pulled out his own charts, so like the ones that my boss was forever working on, I knew they would be talking until well into the night. And so it seems our caravan is expanding, with all that this man brings as he too follows the star, as he too brings gifts for the royalty that the star calls us to greet. For although those who travel with him do not speak our language, we have enough words in common, and we gesture and we point, while our leaders seem to understand one another, perhaps in light of their common education and their common knowledge. Today we came to the great river and began our turn south, still following the road. Now, finally, the star shines before us as it did in the beginning. It has not for quite a while, as we kept our path to the northwest for reasons I neither understood nor questioned. One of the stranger's people, who seems to know some of my language, tells me that there is a great desert south of us, flat plains of sand and rock, too big for such a lot of people to cross together. So we follow the road along inhabited land, by waterways and towns where we can be comfortable in this long journey. For although we follow, he said, laughing, we must be sensible, after all. We still need to trust in our own knowledge, as well as the sign of the newborn king. And I suppose it is much safer to follow this well-worn road than it is to strike out across a waterless wilderness. It's not like we're going to find a king in a desert, anyway. I have learned also that unlike my boss, his is not particularly powerful, not one who engages in politics or decision-making for their nation as mine does, but that he is respected. He creates the chart, gives the knowledge to those who need it, and gets back to his numbers and his calculations. I watch him with my boss, still deferential, head bowed over his notes as she writes messages back. He is focused on this one thing, the star, while she busies herself with every scrap of information she can glean and how this information can best serve her politically. Yet when he speaks, she listens, immersed as he seems to be in the details of what we are doing. For different as they are, each are sages, those who can interpret signs and forecasts, like seeing the birth of a distant king, in a star that shines almost right in our path, and so much higher than it was when we began. These roads are so much more crowded now, not only with the traffic that we'd come to expect, the merchants and the folks on business traveling in and around us, but now, military checkpoints, with pale faces peering at us over an odd armor that seems to take away their humanity. My boss and the man, with all their wisdom, answer the questions of these strange soldiers. Tell them we are looking for the King of the Jews. And between his showing them the incomprehensible calculations, clearly willing to take all the time in the world to explain them, and her powerful bearing and intimidating confidence, we are waved through, directed to the palace, though the two wise ones who lead us decline the offer of an official escort. Well, we made it to Jerusalem, and I almost wish we had accepted that escort. It has been so long since we have been inside a city. The people press in from all sides in the narrow streets, and they stare at us, strangers here, in ways that feel unsettling. For we have made no secret of the reason for our trip, and surely it is expected that we should come to honor the next king. It's not like bringing gifts from one nation to another is unusual. Indeed, when we get close to the gates, another caravan is already there, and word travels back to us that they too have followed the star and come with gifts of honor. My boss and the man, our wise ones, go up to speak with the leader of the other caravan, and we wait, guarding the gifts as the crowds swirl around us. Evening is falling and the palace guards are lighting torches. The windows around us glow in firelight, and the scent of cooking is beginning to make my mouth water. To distract myself, I look up, for the star that has been our companion for so long is nearly overhead here. Nearly, but not quite. And I squint upwards, wondering if it's just me, if I'm not seeing it right, or maybe I'm just not wise enough to know what it looks like to have a star show the way. It was probably just silly of me to think that it would be right exactly over our heads. The caravan begins to move, and I am jolted out of my thoughts. As we move, an entire parade of us now, through the palace gates, which close behind us, I hear my boss's voice carrying through the courtyard. Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage. There is silence for a long moment, and then we are guided into the palace, given time to freshen up and brought before the king, who has ordered a meal prepared for us. The wise ones, including the new one, tall and graceful, are seated by the king at the far end of the room on a platform, while we are given places lower down. I apply myself to the food, which is almost familiar, though the puffy, thick bread is hard to figure out, and I am still distracted by the question of the star. Which might be why I do not notice the kerfuffle around the king until my friend from the other caravan nudges me. King Herod's pale face is blotchy, and even from this distance I can see the anger, though he seems to be trying to contain it. The man who leads my friend's caravan is clutching his notes and charts, as though longing to get a word in, longing to be asked for advice. But my boss has not stopped speaking, her eyes glinting with a look I have long known from her own political machinations, simultaneously calculating and flattering, positioning herself in whatever intrigue is unfolding. The tall leader, the new one, speaks quietly from time to time. Calm and self-possessed, they seem to be mastering the situation better than any, though while they are themselves totally calm, their words do not seem to have the same effect on any of the others. My friend leaned over and whispered to me that they are also a sage, a healer, from far to the south of the great desert. Known to be good in a crisis, he added, with a sideways glance. A good thing, apparently, since their caravan seemed to be crisis-prone, from what he had gathered of their journey. Now the king's staff were dashing off, giving messages requiring urgent response, and Herod and the sages turned their attention back to their food, rather awkwardly at first, until the messengers run back to whisper their responses in the king's ear, and Herod, with an ingratiating smile, turned to my boss, and even from across the room I could recognize the political small talk, the practiced dance of favors exchanged. I watched the man, my friend's boss, relax as Herod asked him about the calculations, listened as he explained in great detail. And the newest one, the healer, leaned in as Herod seemed to let down his guard, his brow suddenly furrowed with concern and worry. And suddenly the palace food weighed heavily in my belly, and I pushed away my plate, wishing I hadn't looked up earlier, wishing I hadn't noticed the star, wishing I could be anywhere but here. I didn't sleep well, and we saw little of the sages until late in the afternoon, when they told us to get ready to leave again. The gifts we had brought were repacked, and our now huge caravan set out through the south gate of the city. The sun passed its zenith, but still bright, casting long shadows that pointed ahead. The sages were at the front this time. It seemed security was no longer an issue. My boss dashing off memos, sending her assistants running about, the man scribbling furiously in his notes, checking and rechecking his complicated instruments and calculations, and the healer, who couldn't seem to be still, called back among their people to calm squabbles or check a stubbed toe, then running back to engage in intense discussions with the other sages. The whole caravan moved heavily, uneasily, very aware that we were in a foreign land, unsure now of our direction and destination, and watching the anxious movements of the sages, the ones who had led us into this strange place with growing concern. By this point, we were all aware that there was no baby in the palace where we had spent the night. Yet even as we moved away, the palace seemed to follow us like an oozing shadow. I could not hear the discussions of the sages, but I knew my boss, and that she would see in this situation a political opportunity, a potential alliance between nations, with herself as the liaison, the sole line of communication. And I had traveled long enough with the man to see his need to know, have his knowledge, and therefore himself, be valuable. I saw the healer's need to be needed, to be in control, even to the point, I suspected, of escalating crises just so that they could solve them. They were playing the role that they long had. These wise ones, the knowledge holders, the power adjacent, seeing, calculating, predicting, forecasting the lives and fortunes of everyone else, but perhaps always with an eye to their own desires. For why else were we going on from the palace? seeking a child who could only be a threat to the status quo. We have come to pay him homage, they had said in Jerusalem, but what homage? What honor is there in using your power to set up a situation like the one we were going to inevitably face? A newborn, even a royal one, is no match for an adult already on the throne with armed guards and spies. My food turned in my stomach again, and I determined to flee the caravan once it was dark enough to slip away unnoticed. There were enough people on the road back to my homeland. I could go back the way we'd come. I could return to my people, find a new life there as though none of this had happened. But we hadn't been 2 hours on the road when the star blazed out in the twilight, right exactly over our heads. Right exactly over a house. A regular house in a regular town, like any of the other ones we'd passed through. Just a house. Hmm. A house, however, which the sages entered, pressed and polished, confident and certain of themselves, gifts at the ready. The townspeople gathered nearby, but not too near. We were well off the main road by now, and I guessed this little town had never seen such a group as we were, not from so far away. A child peeked out from behind its mother, two huge eyes and a mop of curls, just like my nieces and nephews, well, just like I'd been as a child. And I smiled, and the child smiled back, before disappearing back into the safety of the mother, who also smiled and nodded toward the house good-naturedly. And despite my earlier resolution to run, I found myself in the doorway, peering into the light of a dim lamp, and I saw exactly what I knew I would: pack animals and gear, of the guests of the householder, the ladder to the room above where the family lived and where guests would stay, and where there would be a fire and a meal and camaraderie. But the sages hadn't got that far, because in a corner of that first room, essentially the stable, stood my boss, awkwardly holding a baby, as the man tried to show her where to put her hands, how to soothe the newborn's fussing. There was spit up on her shoulder, and she didn't seem to care. She just kissed the top of the infant's head and breathed in deeply. The healer crouched nearby, talking to a couple who seemed the baby's parents, tenderly checking the mother's still swollen belly and occasionally pausing to wipe their eyes. Gold medallion showing the lion and sun, the sort worn only by royalty. The ornate cup engraved with the words King of the Jews, naming the child we had come to find. The chest of herbs, precious medicines against the illnesses that often plague children. All that we had so long carried was nothing to the baby whose every whimper and yawn enthralled those who had so recently thought only of their own advantage. We stayed until the hungry cries of the child spurred the householder to bring out food for the couple and the sages. The latter seemed satisfied enough, watching the baby as he nursed. The little one who had smiled at me now tugged at my sleeve, and I turned to see the people of the town had turned out together to feed us all out in the street. And though I have eaten more, and at more prestigious feasts, I have never felt so well fed as I did that night. And finally the young mother's head came down to rest on her husband's shoulder, and the sages crept quietly out, straw and dust clinging to their beautiful clothes. They paused beside me, blinking in the dark street, and the man whispered, "I remember when my first child was born, how scared I was." The healer put their hand on his arm. "Most parents are. I've delivered dozens of babies. All you want is to keep them safe and healthy." Their voice cracked on the last words, and they bit their lip. My boss just sniffled, wiped her nose on a grubby stable rag, for the first time since I'd known her, at a loss for words. We set out before dawn, south this time, away from Jerusalem, leaving the shadow of Herod's palace in the darkness of night. The healer said they would show us the route across the desert, the ones that merchants and soldiers didn't know, but the shepherds did. No one asked why we weren't going back the way we came. How could one ask a question like that, having been trusted to hold a brand new baby? The sages traveled among us, their calculations and charts put away, for knowledge is only the start of wisdom, and all of their learning only scratched the surface of something they didn't know that they were seeking. The star was at our backs now, lower in the sky each night, as though it, too, were moving away from the stable, away from the threat we hoped to have delayed. It will be a long journey home, with much to consider. But this much I know. Once you have seen new life, in all its beauty and simplicity, you can never go back by the road you came in. Thanks be to God. Alleluia. Amen.